Welcome, welcome to the Brooklyn Rail 721st New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Didier William and Charles Schultz on the event of William's exhibition, Nu Kite Tout, Dèyè, currently on view at the Museum of Contemporary Art, North Miami. We are thrilled to welcome poet Ugochi Egonu here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Didier William is originally from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. His work has been exhibited at the Bronx Museum of Art, the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, the museum at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and the Carnegie Museum, among others. William was an artist in residence at the Marie Walsh Sharpe Art Foundation, and he is the recipient of several awards, including the Rosenthal Family Foundation Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters Sculptors Grants, and a Pew Fellowship. He is currently assistant professor of expanded print at Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University. And our host today, writer and editor Charles Schultz, is managing editor of the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'll pass it over to you, Charlie.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thanks everybody for coming to the Zoom room today. I'm really excited to speak with Didier about this excellent show in Miami. Didier, one of the questions I wanted to open up with was the title of your exhibition. Carolyn said it in Haitian, but I'll say it in English. We've left all that behind. I'd like to ask you to open up the conversation, what that phrase, where that comes from, what that phrase means to you, why you felt it was the phrase to title the exhibition.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Carolyn, for that wonderful introduction. The title came about in several meetings with the curator, Erica, and Dr. James, who's based in Miami. And she and I, as you probably can imagine, had, I can't even remember how many, several lead-up meetings to the show, planning for it. And we talk about the work, but we have longer, more personal conversations too about my family, about our immigration story, about life in Miami. And she would often ask, I'm making all this work that references anecdotes from Haiti, from our early years in the United States. What did my parents think of it? What kind of input did my parents give me? And oftentimes when I asked them, these details about back home, our house back home, the people back home, all that kind of stuff, they would often say, or in English, we left all of that behind, forget about it, we're here now. I think in many ways, themselves sort of shielding themselves from the trauma that was embedded in those narratives, and I guess maybe in their minds inadvertently shielding me from it. So there was always this like wall of memory and this wall of distance that I always felt existed for them when I tried to sort of excavate some of these details. Because we moved here when I was 6 years old, so most of what I know about Haiti is sort of pulled from them and my brothers. But there was always this kind of difficult to penetrate wall that they put up whenever I asked questions about Haiti. They're much more open now that I'm older, but I think in the beginning, the potential to sort of re-traumatize themselves and thereby traumatize me outweighed them being much more transparent. And so in mine and Erica's stories, I would bring this up several times, and it wasn't until maybe about a year and a half into planning for the show that she just felt like, you know what, I think this is the title of the show. And I think for both of us, there was this sort of irony to that title, because as many of us who were from other countries and other places and moved to the United States, realized that you can't, in fact, leave any of that stuff behind. It stays with you. It's in your corporeal reality. It's in your skin. It's in your body. It's in the material around you. I mean, our house was full of artifacts and textiles and things that my mom brought with her from Haiti. Each of those things contained one of these narratives. So it was, in effect, impossible to leave any of this stuff behind. And I think the irony of the title is what excited Erica and what excited me too, because in my work, that material takes different form and gets enmeshed with contemporary narratives and my own personal narratives, and sometimes things that have nothing to do with Haiti. And that web of content, I think, is what sort of excited both of us.
That's really interesting to hear you tell that story, Didier. And it also makes me feel important to mention the curator's name, who you said a couple of times, Dr. Erica James. I believe Erica's from the Bahamas, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Yes, Dr. James from the Bahamas. She
Right.
was actually director of the National Gallery in the Bahamas.
Right.
She taught art history at Yale for a bit, and now she is professor at University of Miami. And when the opportunity for the show came about, Mocha was working with primarily guest curators, and I and Shauna Sheldon immediately thought about Erica being the perfect collaborator for this project.
And what in the process of working with Dr. James, what was there anything that surprised you? Any insight that she had into your work that you didn't see coming, or you weren't you had to kind of step back and think about?
I mean, I tend to think about my work from a very sort of distance perspective. I think because I'm oftentimes working with deeply personal narratives and things, I take the characters and I take the people that make up those narratives and turn them into characters. I take the spaces and turn them into modules that I can sort of shapeshift and move around. And so I'm sort of like a chemist in a lab with this material. But Erica had this amazing ability to sort of take these things that I felt like in many ways sometimes were formal exercises, and I was experiencing them from this sort of objective point of view, and really sort of tease out the deeply personal content that was actually embedded in there. I mean, she's such a phenomenal reader and thinker of images, and she was able to sort of take a broad scope, sort of bird's eye view of my practice and connect dots that I wasn't really even thinking about.
Right, right.
There's one painting that's in the show titled "I Remember When I Was a Little Girl," which was a painting that I actually made at the Walsh Sharpe Art Foundation residency when I was in residence there, now called Sharpe Lentis. And it was one of the first paintings that I made when I was coming back to the figure. And I think initially in conceptualizing the show, I had that painting sort of in the back of my mind, but I didn't think it would be necessarily part of the show. But Erica did an amazing job of kind of zooming back and saying, hey, wait a minute. A lot of the things you're talking about here, the checkpoint for that happened with this painting. And so that painting, once you leave this first room that Caroline is in now, that painting sort of begins.
Carolyn, I think we have that painting. I think we have that painting in the slideshow. And if I remember correctly from looking at the collection, it's the earliest painting in the exhibition. Is that correct?
Yep, it's the earliest painting in the show.
And is it also the only non-figurative work in the show?
It's the only work that doesn't have any, well, it's one of the few works that doesn't have any wood carving. It's number 11, Carolyn. It's the only work that doesn't have any wood carving. But in my mind, I think this painting was the first redirect back to the figure. This kind of inverted phallus, this inverted sexualized form, that was one of the first times I started to think about how gender and sex will be re-performed now that I'm returning to the figure, to the body. Titled, I Remember When I Was a Little Girl, this way that I was conceptualizing queerness in the work, not necessarily even having the language of queerness at the time. And Erica felt like this was such a powerful piece to sort of begin that combo. It's positioned immediately to the left when you walk into the exhibition before you enter the more sort of anecdotal metaphorical, mythological things.
Wow, that's wonderful. So it's really one of the first things that viewers see when they enter the exhibition space.
Yeah, the bottom of it's funny because looking at it now, I can kind of pinpoint the bottom of this painting is what my work looked like, say from like 2009 to 2011. Mostly non-representational, quite abstract. I was doing a lot of pouring. I had just left graduate school, and I think I wanted a break from the body. I wanted a break from anatomy. I wanted a break from the figure. So I wanted to see what material can do, setting up certain conditions of friction and using gravity to sort of engage those conditions. Looking at Frankenthaler and looking at Morris Louis and looking at a lot of abstract expressionist painting. But then something sort of drove me back to the body. Something drove me back to the figure. It sort of coincided with the beginning of state-sanctioned violence on the bodies of Black and Brown people being captured on film, namely Trayvon Martin's murder, who was killed not that far away from Miami, Sanford, Florida, where I grew up. And I started to rethink how I was conceptualizing figuration, how I was conceptualizing the body, how I was conceptualizing representation, and what risks were involved in that, what was at stake in that process, both for me and for the viewer, and how do I slow it down even further even further from just like rote representation? How do I completely sort of halt the process, the circuitry of looking that is built between a viewer and a body on a painting? Still invested in the still image. I wasn't interested in switching to like video or anything. I wanted a discrete single object to do the temporal work of reading a body in space. And I trusted that painting could do that work. And this painting, and one that came not too long after it, titled His Life Depends on Spotted Lies, which was the first time I started carving anything. It's a much smaller piece. I think it's 18 by 20 or 16 by 20, very small piece. That similar process to this painting that you're looking at now. There was a kind of a portrait figure and a tapestry, kind of a picnic, green and blue picnic tapestry in the back. And the figure itself was stained. And then I think out of frustration, I think out of boredom, I think out of a curious desire to see something else in the picture, I started carving onto the surface instead of painting the eyes where they would normally go. I carved two eyes onto the surface of the panel. I had printmaking materials because my MFA was in painting and printmaking. So I had all these wood carving materials at my disposal. I was working on this panel, and I just kept carving into it. I carved right up until the sort of base of the neck, from the top of the head to the base of the neck. And at the end of that experience, I realized that I hadn't just removed something, I had added something to the panel. I thought I was engaged in this reductive process of taking stuff away, but in effect, taking something away actually added something to the panel that wasn't previously there. And I didn't know how to name it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know anything about it. I just knew that it was deeply physically satisfying, and something had happened that I didn't anticipate. And I've sort of been in that curious space with carving ever since. I haven't left it, except now it's ballooned into my entire studio practice.
There's you said so many things there, Didier. One of the things I want to ask about at the end, you noted having printmaking materials lying about your studio to experiment with. I know a lot of these pieces are made on birch panels. Yeah. I guess my question is, and a lot of them are large. So my question, as it gets to your experience of gouging these eyes, how did it change as you began to scale up the work and to continue with the gouging?
So in the beginning, I was doing them manually, which, as you can imagine, was torture on my wrist joints. And actually the first one I did just like on my bed in my Brooklyn apartment, and then like dusted off all the sawdust so that I wouldn't get stabbed by it when I went to bed. And then subsequently I started to think about, well, what kinds of tools could I use to dig deeper and further into the surface of the wood, I worked with a fabricator who's based in New York. And he suggested birch, because birch is a soft enough material. So I started carving into the birch, and then started really thinking about the scale and size of the bodies, and how I could get that to sort of replicate from the drawings that I was beginning with. I have assistants who work with me, and everything begins at drawing. So I have hundreds and hundreds of drawings that sometimes don't even make it to the paintings. The drawings that I enjoy and that I'm excited about, that I want to sort of invest more into, I transfer them into the surface of the panel. They then get stained with dark, like black Indian ink. Once that staining is dry, then I draw the anatomy of the figures onto the panel, and then they get carved with a rotary tool. And so it sounds like a dentist's office in my studio pretty much all day. And you mentioned the scale of them. In the beginning, I think there was like a 1-to-1 or maybe even a small ratio. The figures were kind of much smaller and more intimate. But then I wanted them to be larger than life. I wanted them to be just outside of life scale. I wanted if the figures could sort of stand up outside of the panel, they would be like 8 or 9 feet tall. And I've kept that sort of size ratio, that scale ratio consistently, in part because there's something sort of autobiographical about the bodies. And I'm a pretty big guy, I always have been. So always been aware of how the measurements of the sort of conventional world are designed with a particular body in mind. And when you are outside of that particular measurement scale, you're hyper aware of it. And how could I turn that into a sort of super strength rather than something that was diminishing? So they're always in this space of titans and sort of a dream space rather than human space. I don't even think, the question has come up a lot. I don't think I think about them as humans. I don't think of them as people. I think of them more as apparitions or titans, something larger than, something bigger than human, something much more aspirational than human. And that also allows me to kind of project further into the mythology of these narratives.
Yeah, I really like thinking of them as titans. But before we go on talking about the titans, I want to come back and thinking about bodies here. I want to come back and put our bodies back in this exhibition.
Sure.
So Caroline, if you would take us to the smaller room that has the darker walls. Just want to give the Zoom audience a chance to see the space here. It's a big show. There's more than 40 paintings. One room is set up as a sort of an antechamber, and then there's a secondary room that is large, right? The walls are white. This room I found to be very fascinating. And I mean, the choice interesting to me to have one large room full of paintings and then the smaller room. And the smaller room, as you can see, also has some substantial paintings, new paintings, as well as, thank you, Caroline, etchings and works on paper on the side here. I guess 2 questions. One is so many questions. Let me get to a specific one. These 3 paintings, of all the paintings, why did you select these 3, or why did you and Dr. James select these 3 to be in this room with the etchings?
Great question. Before I answer it, just to the right of the screen that Caroline has up now are a wall of prints that have been made contiguous to the paintings. And initially, we didn't think about including the prints, but as of about the last maybe 3-4 years, discrete print has started to become a bigger part of my practice. And Erica and our conversation started just as this was happening. And so as she started to discover some of these prints, she was like, we have to include a wall of prints in the exhibition. So that's what you see on the right, that's what's in front of you now. And then facing those prints are 3 paintings. 2 paintings that are of these houses sort of precariously and buoyantly nestled within this mass of bodies. and then the one immediately to the left, Just Us Three, which was a painting that I made, or I started right at the beginning of the pandemic. Maybe I'll start with that one. That was a really sort of difficult painting because it was one that was about my husband and I becoming parents. And I knew I wanted to make a painting about the experience, and I didn't yet anticipate that journey of ours would align almost exactly with a global pandemic. Oh, I just lost my screen. Forgive me. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. I just lost my screen.
No problem.
There we go. I didn't anticipate that would align with a global pandemic. So I sat back, my student, and was like, what do I do how do I have this experience? What's this gonna look like? What's it gonna be like? I don't know how it's gonna play out. And so I wanted to make a piece that highlighted the fact that for almost more than a year, actually, it was just the three of us, myself, my husband, and our daughter, living in this space where we're experiencing something with everybody else at the same time as everyone else. But we couldn't share space together. We couldn't introduce our friends to our baby. We couldn't introduce our family to our baby. It felt like we were sitting on this sort of precarious cliff, not knowing what was behind us and not knowing what was ahead of us, but needing to just sort of clutch and hold on to one another as best as we can. And that's how the painting came about. This painting that, tried its best to imagine what life could be like, or what it looked like for us to have a child during this really tense time that everyone was going through. And titled the painting Just Us Three. I would often get asked the question, it must have been insane to have a baby during a pandemic. What was that like? How was that? How did you guys go through that? And I would often say, well, we don't know what it's like to have a baby not during a pandemic. So for us, all of the challenges of parenting and of COVID were enmeshed in one another. And then there was also, I must say, there was also this incredible amount of presence that having a new child forced into our lives. Like, we couldn't go anywhere anyway. And so, and we had to be at home with the baby anyway. So there was this silence around that moment that, in looking back at it, of course, was this really difficult time for all of us. But in looking back at it, all I remember are the times where we were just hanging out at home with the baby and experiencing all these new things.
I love that the body language is not what one would expect. The way the small figure is kind of crawling on the two larger figures, and the way the figures are they're interlocked in a way that really communicates a level of togetherness and even tenderness, despite the fact that they're not like the most typical forms of one figure embracing or touching another. I'm curious, how did you settle on this body language?
I wanted it awkward. I wanted it awkward. Anybody, who has had a child can attest to, and it was our first baby. We now have 2 kids. Our son is 5 months old. But there was a lot of awkwardness to, going from a couple to being a family of 3, and the entire landscape of our home changing, and our relationships to each other changing, and us trying to figure out how to sort of handle this new unit of 3. Because there's a lot of awkwardness to it, and I didn't want sentimentality to sort of take over the painting. I wanted the bodies sort of Tetris-like attempt to interlock with one another to be the sort of fulcrum of the painting.
Yeah, I really like that a lot. I like this sort of flexibility and that the figures all make together. And I'm looking at also the image of the house here on the screen beside it, and I wanted to talk about that image as it connects to a couple of the prints on the wall beside it, the prints that are titled Cursed Grounds, Cursed Bodies.
Yes.
When I was looking at them, it appeared to me, and hearing you talk about making the prints alongside the paintings, thank you, Carolyn, makes me wonder if this is one of those cases. But the shape that is sort of how I read it is subterranean here looks similar to the shape that is enveloping the houses on the underside. Are these connected? Is that a similar form that is moving?
It's the two works aren't connected, but I have been thinking, and a lot of the recent works and the newer works, I have been thinking a lot about this idea of looking at two spaces at once, looking at multiple spaces at once. You know, the picture plane then straddles an area above some kind of cross section of Earth and in the area below. That has become this whole series of works called Cursed Grounds. The one in the exhibition is Cursed Grounds, Blessed Bones, which is a 4-plate copper etching that was printed in collaboration with Holland Weaver Press in New York. Felix did a phenomenal job with that print. And then the others have been paintings that also follow this kind of stratified earth composition, where you're looking at an area above and you're looking at an area that's at eye level and you're looking at an area below. And the area below makes up these like conglomeration of bodies, these ancestors, for lack of a better word. And then the area above, in some cases, is a landscape. In that particular print, it's this park that's close to our house, Loma Park, that we like to take my daughter to. And it has these really beautiful trees that she loves to run around in. And I took a picture of it, drew those trees out, and then in print, it's a spit bite. So it's I think a 4 or 5 color spit bite that makes up those trees. And then at the bottom of the print is the eye pattern printed in a flat bite. And then there's another pattern underneath it, which you can see a little bit in yellow, like a yellowy green. And that's the Haitian Vodou Veve of Papa Lekpa, who's the guardian of the underworld. And so you're looking at these two different spaces at the same time that offer two completely different realities. And one thing to mention in the print, I really wanted the bodies to feel like they were made out of machines or something. Once we printed that proof and I saw the like beautiful capacity of intaglio, but next to the trees, it felt really rigid and stiff, and I loved that. And so I wanted if it could be auditory, I wanted it to sound like chains rattling, completely different from the way that conglomeration of bodies happens in the paintings. Yeah. The painting that you were mentioning, the two paintings that you were mentioning, are the first two houses that my family lived in Miami. And those paintings came about kind of not necessarily suddenly, but once I knew the show was going to happen, and I knew the show was going to include all of these paintings that were metaphorical and mythological, and me sort of indulging all of these fantastical modes of storytelling, it felt important to sort of bookend the exhibition and frame the literal location where those things took place. Some of the paintings are about events that happened in Miami with me and my brothers, our immigration process, intimate moments that happened to me in Miami, accidents that happened in Miami, traumatic and horrific moments that happened in Miami. The containers for all of those things were these two houses that we live in. And for those two paintings, I wanted to shift the visual language and pull up architectural renderings of those houses and try to remain pretty faithful to those renderings and those measurements, and preserve and respect the integrity of these houses, even though they're sort of nestled in these masses, they're nestled in these spaces, and still subject to that fragile history. I wanted the houses to sort of reign supreme in the exhibition and claim that space right away, and really in some ways honor those houses, because the early 90s were a very difficult time for Haitian immigrants in this country. It's never not been a difficult time for Haitian immigrants in this country. And so these houses were the spaces that kept us safe and kept us secure and protected us when we were applying for American citizenship, and contained a lot of the documents that kept my family in good standing with the American government, and when we were worried about deportation. These are the houses that contained a lot of that stuff. And I wanted those houses to be part of the conversation. And so when you walk into the exhibition, you see the first house, which is the greenhouse, and then you see the orange house, which is actually where my parents live currently. And then in between them on the perpendicular wall is just us three.
It's a really beautiful triangulation of paintings and ideas, and it really communicates a whole lot about home and containers and really what builds life, what sustains life, what structures enable life. As I look at the two paintings of the two houses, they seem to my eye as if they're floating in this sort of the space that, as you described so well, has something that might be connecting to ancestors, something very much connecting to nature, but there's sort of an amorphous area around this.
Yeah.
Do you read it as floating? Do you read it differently? How does that composition settle for you?
I don't object to floating. I often like to think of them as groundless, because it's always been my position that I wanted to remove ground and remove gravity from the paintings, but keep their presence intact. And if I could extract gravity from the work, if I could extract gravity from the reality that I'm trying to depict, but keep everything else contained, what kind of liberation could that offer my characters? What kind of freedom could that offer me in terms of presenting these things in a way that was more honest and truthful to what I and my loved ones experienced? And so I like the idea of them floating. I think process-wise, it's always a question for me when I'm building these compositions. How do I make them as groundless as possible? One of my favorite painters is Robert Colescott, and I think Colescott in many ways had a similar sort of strategy in many of his paintings, where you feel like the entire thing is sort of, if you tilted the painting this way, everything would slide off the table or slide off the ground. And I think it added this level of perceptual instability that made Colescott's painting even more politically jarring and even more politically powerful, not just the content, but that the actual infrastructure of the painting was being sort of, the pegs were being pulled out of it. And that's always been my favorite thing about Colescott's work, and I've always envied that and wanted to replicate it in my work. And so others have mentioned it as a kind of a lift, as a kind of a groundlessness, as a kind of a floating. And I love that. I love, because it all points to this idea that flight is liberatory. And that's kind of where I want them to sit.
As you talk about groundlessness, excuse me, and trying to work away from gravity, I'm thinking of the sculpture that you made for the show. Forgive me, I'm not able to think of the name right away, but I see. Thank you, Poto Mitan. I see bodies in a manner that doesn't necessarily include a traditional type of groundlessness. And this is yet another form, and I think it's important that we speak a little bit about working in 3 dimensions, having touched on printmaking and painting. This is a stunning work, and I can imagine to be near it. It is significantly taller than a physical frame, and it's all the way in the round. And I know that it connects to these ideas of totems and rituals, and therefore it like the other work is layered with mythologies, but also very much connecting to your own work and the other bodies. And like I would see here, there's a sense of awkwardness as well in like the way that you've stacked them.
Yeah.
How much do you feel, or even a painting like a painting like Totem, where their bodies do kind of rise in this way? Do you see it similarly as an escape from gravity and a move towards liberation? Like
I do, and I don't know how many images of this we have, Caroline, but it does hover off the ground about.
It hovers too.
Yeah, so when you're when you're in the space, it hangs from airline. There, you can see it a little bit better. When
Yeah.
you're in the space, it hangs from airline wire, but it doesn't touch the ground. It hovers, I think, about 8 inches. So it just kind of floats in the center of the room as you're looking at the rest of the paintings. And, you know, as you mentioned, Charlie, the paintings have personal anecdotes, they have historical anecdotes, and then they also have mythological stories that are tied to Haitian worship rituals in Haitian Vodou. And some of those patterns and some of those symbols are in the exhibition. And so when Erica and I were talking about the show, and I pointed to my interest and previous history in sculpture, I decided to make a new work for the exhibition, this stack of bodies that's about 12 feet tall, 12 and a half feet tall, and title it Poto Mitan. In Haitian Vodou, the Poto Mitan is the pole in the center of the room around which ritual and worship takes place. The pole is considered to be the sort of portal, the gateway between our world and the world of the gods, and that it's believed that they travel actually through the pole. So it's very, very often you would hang worship objects on the pole. You would hang precious objects and things that you love on the pole. Many times it's made of wood, and then sometimes it's even made of an actual living tree. But in my work, I wanted the pole to still be a portal, to still be a gateway, but I wanted that gateway to be made of bodies. Because I think in many ways, regardless of the specificities of the narrative, when we're talking about narratives of immigration, oftentimes the unit of measurement is the body, the way in which we sort of gauge our distance between now and something that we call home is either our body, through our body, or the bodies of ones that we love. So it made sense for me to take this thing that would be normally an inanimate object and actually animate it with the bodies of my characters, so that it sort of felt like the bodies were jumping from the surface of the paintings and right into the middle of the room. And it's right in the center, so that when you walk into the exhibition, you sort of have to walk around it in order to see the paintings, and it's always sort of hovering behind you.
It's really beautiful. Also, Caroline, if you can just hold here for a second, because that painting, this really gives a great visual of the depth and the eyes. Caroline, if you could go to one more of those details where we could just see, yeah, perfect. Earlier, you were talking about your move from non-representational work to representational work through the tragic experience of Trayvon Martin. And it wasn't just bodies that began to appear in your work, but bodies that, as I read one where I really liked an epidermal eye shield. And I liked this idea of bodies that were made of eyes. So many things happening in that conjugation, but you've been doing it now for, well, like a decade. So I'm curious, over that lapse of time, how has the meaning of a body covered with eyes, has it shifted for you at all? Has it changed? Has it stayed solid? What's happened over the last decade?
Yeah, I love this question, because it has changed. And I think I've only loosely taken stock of all the ways that it's changed. Initially, the startling thing about it, I think the thing that surprised me about it was that it forced me to be super present. That's also what I loved about it. That was also the thing that sort of scared me, because it brought me right to the surface of the work. It was a literal measurement of the amount of time I spent at that surface of the work, about 6 to 8 inches away. It's a literal trace of that period of time. And so the reductive process gave way to this experience of complete presence and complete disavowal of everything else that was going on around me. And I wanted that to happen with my viewer when they're looking at the paintings too, because that for me gets closer to the experience of representation than any kind of illusionistic process. And that moment has evolved over time to really become this question of presence that I think is essential when we're talking about representation writ large, but specifically the representation of narratives that include Black and Brown people. It's a temporal, fragile, vulnerable process that I've always wanted to sort of hold on to and sort of insist that my viewers experience as well. And over time, that moment has expanded to not just include the bodies in the paintings, but it's now part of the way that the actual architecture is built in the paintings. It's kind of forced me to think about, well, what is the tapestry that makes up the architecture of this space that I'm thinking about as my family's living room? But now the wall is made up of this map of Haiti. Now the fabric on the bed sheet is made up of these symbols in Haitian Vodou that my mom talked about very often, but that I never thought about in this way. It's turned into a strategy to think about how everything materializes rather than taking for granted the sort of perceptual tricks that I can use to make them look quote unquote real. That became much less interesting to me. And the temporal process of bringing those things to an experiential condition for the viewer became much more interesting to me. And I think the first time I saw that happening was when I started carving eyes onto just the bodies of the figures. Now I think it's permeated into every other part of the surface.
It's really fascinating to hear you talk about how you're layering information into the paintings in an increasingly complicated manner, and I find one of the challenges to doing that is that your viewer or your audience doesn't always have access to that information. So you know, we come to the work with what we have. Yeah. We find what we find, and
well, I love that point. I love that point, but I think it highlights the fact that I think a mistake we made is that we don't often think that loss is part of representation. But 99% of the times, loss is very much a part of it for those who are being represented. And so I like the idea that there is something lost in the process here. There's something lost in it certainly for me. There's something lost in it certainly for the viewer. And contending with that loss, I think, is part of what we're talking about when we talk about, again, representation writ large, but specifically the representations of Black and Brown people whose histories are already subject to a tremendous amount of loss. I think wrestling with that condition, both in the process and in the way that work is read and consumed, needs to be sort of centered. That's very, very important for me. I think there was another question that you had, Charlie, about language, and this question of loss is evident there too, because sometimes the works are titled in Haitian Creole, and sometimes I've given translations, and other times I've asked my gallery not to give translations. And what that sort of subjects us to is that, well, you know, some of your guests won't know what this painting is titled and what you're saying. And I'm okay with that, because there's other layers of legibility that that person who can't speak the language can sort of hook onto and grab onto and still sort of get into the content of the work. I think those layers of legibility, stacking those layers of legibility is really exciting for me, because sometimes it gives way to things that I never even imagined.
I couldn't agree with you more about that, Didier. And I would, the only thing I would challenge is I don't think of it as loss. I think of it as a sense of opacity. You know, because for me, when I look at the Haitian titles, just for example, I can't read them. Yeah. I don't walk away and think, well, I'm never going to get that title because I'm willing to work for it. So I'm willing to do a little. I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to expand. One of the things that I can sense as well is that you know, when there's aspects in the painting, let's say the voodoo mythology that I wouldn't be visually familiar with, but I would see this iconography. You know, I would recognize that there is a language that is being presented here, and I would I would respond to it differently. I would respond to it, I think, maybe in a way that might in some way have paralleled your experience as an immigrant in a child immigrant in Miami, where you can see, yeah, there's a message there.
Yeah.
It's not available to me, but like I can see underneath that image and I can start to understand what it might mean.
Yeah.
And when you said earlier about slowing down, this is one of the ways that I think that happens for a viewer in real time when it comes to working through really any one of your paintings.
Yeah. No, I love that point. And I love the Glissantian nod to opacity there. And the speed of it is critical. The slowing down is critical because I think reading these works over a period of time is how they're best seen. And one of the things that I always love is that they're virtually impossible to photograph. You know, the JPEGs of them only go so far because Caroline zoomed into that one spot on the carving, and you could kind of see a little bit of the lift that the carving actually creates on the surface, which casts a bit of a shadow, which responds to light in the same space that the viewer is also standing in. And so viewing them is a very physical process. And I sort of submit to the fact that, like, you know, JPEGs will only capture so much, and the actual physicality of the painting needs to be experienced in real time to get to that point of slowness that you're talking about, so that the layering is actually more apparent, and the kind of buttressing of edges up against one another is much more apparent. That's also something that I think responds to this question of speed that you're bringing up, which I think is a great one. I nerd out on the edges that happen on these surfaces quite a bit, and oftentimes that's one of the ways I judge whether or not a work is finished. It has really less to do with the picture and more to do with what the surface and the edges are doing to one another. Once that friction reaches a kind of crescendo, that's when I get most excited and think, okay, this painting is doing what I wanted it to do.
Well, I really like that. That is that's a cool way to understand when your paintings are approaching completion. I want to take a little bit of a side turn. We've talked an awful lot about the objects, and we haven't talked too much about people in your life. I just want to, we've talked about Dr. James, but if there were two people that you had to think of who've had a profound impact on your evolution as an artist, who would you point to? What stories would you tell me?
I mean, the first one is a no-brainer, and it's my mom. Oftentimes people ask if there are any other artists in my family, and we don't have any other visual artists in my family, but my mom is a chef, and so she's been cooking her entire life. She started at the American Embassy in Haiti when she was 13 years old, and she virtually lived there, and she, you know, grew to run it, and that's where she learned how to cook. And then once we moved here to the United States, she had her own restaurant with a friend of hers. But the way in which she thinks about food is how I think about painting, and the alchemy that she brings to food. I, you know, hung out with her as a kid constantly and saw her taking raw material and turning it into stuff that smelled and tasted like magic. And I experienced that my entire adolescence, and I absorbed it. And I do the exact same thing, but with paint and paper and wood and acrylic and oil and pigment. But that alchemy, the first place I witnessed and learned the potential of that alchemy is watching my mother in the kitchen. So she is a kind of a no-brainer for me in that regard. And then the other person I think who comes to mind right away is one of my mentors in graduate school, Rochelle Feinstein, who was the first person to actually begin to encourage me to think about where the overlap might occur between my paintings and my prints. You know, very early on in our studio visits, Rochelle would be like, well, you're doing something here with layers and textures and surface, and you're wanting to do something here with layers and textures and surface. How can they come together in a way that's process-based rather than so sort of heady and conceptual? And I always think about our kind, still do think about our conversations when I'm working on these things, where my printmaking practice and my painting practice have now become so enmeshed that they're kind of indistinguishable from one another. The first person that encouraged me in that direction was Rochelle. So I have to give a nod to her.
No, I would not have thought of her work. That is such a, I'm so glad I asked, because it is really has really given me a lot to think about, how her work and your work now. I love listening to the story about your mother cooking as well. I had a very important kitchen in my household, and I try to be that in the household that I now am part of.
If you ever go to Miami, her restaurant's in Broward, and it is amazing, if I do say so.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, there's someone on our team who's going to Miami, so we'll have to make sure she knows. Let's we've got this beautiful painting, Soup Jumeau, on the screen. Now I want to know how much this is a nod to your mother, if at all, or something else entirely.
I mean, it's very much a nod to my mom, for all the reasons I described, but it's also, I made it at a time where I had just started making my own soup jumeau. Soup jumeau is squash soup, and Haitians make it on January 1st, because January 1st, in addition to being the beginning of the new year, it's Haitian Independence Day. And this soup was a culinary masterpiece that was forbidden to the stolen enslaved West Africans in Haiti. And promptly upon independence, it became the national dish, and Dessalines wanted it served and consumed on January 1st to sort of commemorate this thing that was forbidden from us to now being this thing that we can enjoy and consume as rightfully ours. And so to this day, every January 1st, if you're Haitian, you need to either make it yourself or go find a Haitian restaurant and find it, or go to an aunt's house or an uncle's house and find it. And in this year, when we had kids, my mom said, well, now you have your own kids, so you need to make your own soup. And so I made it and snapped a picture of it and sent it to her. And she asked me how it tasted, and I said, it tastes pretty good, but not like yours. But I liked the picture, and so I printed the picture out, brought it with me to the studio, and made a painting of it.
Wow. Thank you, Didier. Thank you for all the time that you've given today. I've really been moved speaking with you, and I've enjoyed it a lot. Carolyn, I will hand it off to you to pick up with the Q&A.
Great, amazing. Thank you both so much. Our first question is going to be from our friend GE, and you should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you so much. Question is, while it seems as though the body is always implicated in obvious social and political contexts, is it also implicated in psychic and spiritual context as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think the context in which it could be implicated physically is primarily anatomical and sort of rational. But I would actually relate this to Charlie's question about scale. The psychic and spiritual context is the space in which I find room to make the body into something other than human. Is the space in which I invent anatomy, is the space in which I invent limbs and parts of bodies because they make sense on a sort of psychic and spiritual level, and probably would undermine the sort of anatomic rationale that the body would otherwise be subjected to. And I try to stay sort of specific and personal with that, and so that it changes from painting to painting. It changes from narrative to narrative. So, for example, there's one painting in the show that's about Matan Toya, who was one of the few women who fought in the Haitian Revolution. The way the body presents itself in that painting is very different than the painting of my husband and I and our daughter standing at the precipice of a cliff. So the sort of rationale around how the body is built changes, I think, specifically at the moment of the psychic or the spiritual connection. I love that question.
No, thank you so much. I love the answer.
Thank you. Let's see, next we have a question from Nicole Awai. You should be able to unmute. If you go ahead.
Oh, hi. Is
Hi,
it,
Nicole.
are you hearing me? Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Okay. Hi, Didier. Hey, so I'm sorry, there might have been typos in the question. So yes, I was really thinking about the piece, the sculpture, what you're referring to as a sculpture. And you know, that I think that it's really important that its success is that it's not really a traditional sculpture, you know, that it is this floating shaped painting, yes, that really enhances this feeling of it being a portal that brings up questions about chance and temporality for sure, right? Which makes it, I think, even more effective in that way. I really wish that I could see it. I'm thinking that I could be standing at a certain angle and it would just be a line as well, right? Exactly. But what it also brings up to me is questions of perspective, right? And how people see us as immigrant bodies, right? But also these issues around how we present ourselves and safety. And I was wondering, for you, if those were, if you were very aware of that in making this piece, and if you would talk about that a little bit more.
I mean, I'm aware of that in making all the work. I'm aware of that when I walk out of the house, aware of that when my husband and I are holding hands. I'm aware of that when we're speaking Creole in Miami or elsewhere. I think that's a critical point, and that's one of the things that I loved about the sculpture as well. And it's something that I honestly, I knew it, but I wasn't aware of how powerful it would be until we installed the sculpture in that space. That if you walk to a certain angle in the exhibition, you just see a very straight black line in the middle of the room, and then it reveals itself slowly as you sort of continue walking. And that potential to disappear, I found really powerful. And that question of maybe not invisibility, but anonymity, which I think has a sort of subtext of shielding and protection to it, became really powerful for me. And it's also one of the reasons why up until recently, the figures didn't have faces. They have these sort of orbs where their heads are, but they don't have a sort of traditional 2 eyes, nose, mouth, ears that you can ascribe to some kind of likeness. Because I saw that not only as a kind of ease of legibility, but I saw that as something that would make them quite vulnerable. And that if they could, in fact, leverage a kind of protective anonymity and still remain sort of closely focused on the viewer with their totalizing gaze, that would actually make them more powerful and more sort of titanic. That makes sense, Nicole?
No, definitely makes sense. I'm so glad you did share that painting from 2011 that you did at Yale. And I'm thinking of how, I'm thinking about you as a painter, but also as a printmaker, unmasking layers, for sure. And from that initial painting, the way that these layers have become legible, but then the layering is very much still there. And also probably thinking now, as I'm remembering that painting from that time, it makes me think about other works that may later on become sort of unhinged, as you move forward with your practice as well. And I just find that very interesting and exciting, and I've been able to witness that. So yes.
Thank you, Nicole. And there's one painting in the show that kind of points in that direction. It's a painting of this figure sort of submerged underwater. And some of the newer works are maybe not unshielding, but making clearer the idea that this eye sort of chainmail that covers them is in fact a removable shield. Some of the newer works are beginning to move in that direction.
Yes, looking forward to seeing what comes next.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, David, I see you there. You should be able to unmute now to ask your question.
Well, I really feel like Didier is speaking in the last few moments a lot about things that really start shedding some light on how it is that this work takes on a presence as like a permeable membrane with many eyes, so that we feel that the work is seeing us as viewers. And thereby it becomes a presence that engages us in dialogue as a two-way street in the present tense. And so it is embodied, but not as a fixed image. It is materializing spirit and spiritualizing matter. And as such, I feel like that is really starting to break down something that is very concrete, but also mysterious and very hard to talk about, even though I consider it something crucial if art is actually to claim or reclaim its psychological function. So that it's beautiful, but there's also a confrontational aspect to it, a kind of truth telling that, I don't know, I feel like several of the people, including Nicole's comments, got a little bit at that idea that the work begins to function as a portal that starts to cut through both ways, through seeing, but also thinking and being. So anyway, I thank you. Very cool.
Thank you, David. I love that comment.
Thanks, David. We just have one, sorry, we have a question from Nabil. And you should be able to unmute if you're there. Let's see, maybe not. Nabil just wrote in the chat, how did it feel? Oh, are you there?
I was just reading the question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, he wrote, how did it feel when working with Dèyè?
Vevés. The vevés are the symbols that you would draw traditionally in chalk on the ground during Haitian Vodou. In the paintings, when those patterns show up, oftentimes, first they start out as a print. So I'll draw them onto copper, etch the copper, print it onto rice paper usually, then scan that rice paper. In the previous work, this is how it happened. I'd scan the rice paper into the computer, turn that into a film, and then turn that screen printed film that is now a pattern, I print that onto another piece of rice paper, and then that would get collaged onto the panel of the painting. That distancing I really loved in a lot of the previous work. Now, more often than not, I will usually print that pattern relief directly onto the surface of the panel, which has been primed and sealed, and then the surface of the panel will then receive the relief print pattern directly on top. And to answer Nabil's question about how did it feel, it feels kind of like a mindfulness exercise. Very similar to how I work with the eyes, it brings me right into the sort of time of the painting. It's hard to rush that process. Anybody in the call who's familiar with printmaking, it's very hard to rush printmaking. It's the one thing that's going to take as long as it takes. And the moment you try to rush it, the moment you stop being present with it, you're gonna screw up the print. And so materially, formally, I love introducing print into the process for that reason. But also because I'm working with these symbols that represent Loas from Haitian Vodou, that represent these gods that are part of my ancestry and part of my history, that presence becomes almost like a prayer. It becomes like a mindfulness exercise, becomes like a meditation. And I'll usually have either some kind of audiobook or music on and completely tune out the rest of the world. And for that moment, all that matters is this area within my field of vision that is taking form via this pattern of the bébé. Did that answer the question, Ria?
Oh, hi. Suddenly I'm able to unmute. Merci, Didier. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I can only imagine how loaded in a good way it would be to work with Dèyè. Thank you so much for answering that question. I suppose my only follow-up would be whether there was always clarity for you as to which Dèyè called to you the most to work with.
Really good question. No, there wasn't. I knew the ones that my mom would often cite as a kid, and so I gravitated to As you lead Danto, As you lead Rouge, right away, and then have discovered others along my research and ones that I now have my own personal experience with. But it wasn't super clear, and I think like many other parts of my practice that include content in Haiti, my first means of access to it was through my folks, through my mom and dad. The clarity sort of came as the kind of universe of my studio began to be built, and I kind of knew what characters I wanted to play what movies. I've never been asked that question, but it's a good question.
Great,
Thank you so much, Didier. And I think just thank you more broadly. As an anthropologist in training, as an artist, I really think we're at an interesting point where Haiti is finally getting the new narrative she deserves, and I see your work is really playing a part of that. So thank you, merci.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nabil. And our final question today is going to come from our programs director, Chloe Stagnan.
Hi, Chloe.
Thank you so much, Didier, for this conversation today. It's been absolutely amazing. And thank you, Charlie, too. I have so many questions that I want to ask, but I've narrowed it down. I want to ask you two things. One is, I want to know about the role of the outline in your work. I notice, in the hanging sculptures, just the black outline on the sides, and it creates this really interesting visual duality to both sides of the sculptures, and it also creates this revelatory aspect to experiencing them. And I wonder if you can speak to that. Maybe I'll start there.
Oh my God, I love that question so much. It wasn't until one of my assistant pointed out, I think like 3 years ago, I was working and he was like, do you realize how many times you go over the same line? And when he pointed that out, I was like, holy shit, like it's gotta be at least 6 or 7 times. And there's this process of like rediscovering the line over and over again. I think part of it is because I love drawing and I access my work through drawing. One of my art teachers, mentors, friends, art oracles, Sam Messer, sort of affirmed my love of drawing. He's on the call. Sort of affirmed my love of drawing when I was in school, and it's remained to be the thing that like my entire practice hangs on. So formally, I think it's about this sort of drawing process, but I think lines essentially become borders, right? Like if I'm thinking about painting as a kind of a topography or geography, wherever I draw that line, I'm sort of establishing a border. I'm establishing a border that defines two different realities. I'm establishing a border that sort of splits up the space in a completely non-demographic way. I'm building a kind of terrain that then is demarcated by this artificial reality, this artificial conception called a line. And I realized, I think partly with this show, how important lines and, as you say, outlines are in terms of establishing a space, both outlines that I draw, but also outlines that happen sort of organically just when two edges meet. So part of that alchemy that we talked about in the earlier part of the call you know, things that are poured and things that are cut and things that are gouged and things that are stained eventually will form an edge on the surface of the panel, which creates an outline, which creates an edge. And just as much as I'm like drawing and articulating these lines, there are other lines being formed that are just like a surprise of the process. And I sort of geek out and love that much too. And especially when two different lines meet and try to do the same work, and that creates a different kind of reality. I just think, I love that question. And I feel like we can have a whole other call on just the line.
Thank you so much. And then really quickly, I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned your mom and food, and food is such a chorus experience. You know, it brings people together, it creates opportunity to share. And I feel like the same could be said for your work. And I wonder what it's been like to share it with your family and also with friends, and also share it with yourself over time and return to it, and how that's shaped your relationship with it.
It's hugely affirming to share food. You know, I'm the principal cook in our family, and making something and seeing my kids and my husband enjoy it and run back to the kitchen is like, I can't even explain how that feels. My mom is a cook and takes great pride in cooking. And so when we were kids, like food was always an event. It was never like Tuesday night dinner was an event, just like, you know, at the scale of like Thanksgiving or something. And I've always been around food that way. And then even most recently, the show at MoCA for our reception in December, we had a big celebration party that Thursday during Miami Art Week. And the museum, once they found out that my mom had a restaurant, they were like, your mom's restaurant should cater the party. And so my mom catered this party for 1,000 people. And they were looking at my work on the walls and eating food that my mom cooked and listening to Haitian music.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was all just too much. I couldn't handle it. It was pretty phenomenal. Watching the visual consumption and the sort of oral consumption taking place at the same time was really powerful. And food still, I think there'll be more food paintings in the future. That was so exciting. So yeah, I mean, it's huge. It's huge part of my practice and part of who I am.
Incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Didier. There's some requests in the chat for the name of your mom's restaurant. No pressure.
I'll type it in the chat.
Cool, thank you. I'm saying, let's see, great. All right, for all those who asked, or everyone in Miami, definitely go check that out. And I'm so excited, as per our Rail tradition, to end today's amazing talk with a poetry reading. And today we're lucky to have Ugochi Egonu here with us. Ugochi Egonu is a freelance writer, editor, and performance artist currently based in Brooklyn. They write to heal, learn, and build community. They are currently the editor of the forthcoming anthology, Before We Become Ancestors, by and for queer and femme Nigerians. Their work has appeared in publications like Rookie Magazine, Refinery 29, and Teen Vogue. Thank you so much, Ugochi, for being here today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Thank you to Brooklyn Rail, and thank you, Didier. It was really, really exciting to be able to engage with your work like this. Earlier, Charlie was asking if I had picked poems out or if I was gonna like decide based off of the conversation. And funny enough, we have some similar themes in the poems that I picked out in the in your work, in the conversation that we had. So very excited for that, and like it was really cool seeing that play out. So the first two poems that I have are from a sonnet sequence called Kanyi Pepere, which means let us pray in Igbo. And the two specific poems that I picked out are in the voice of a god or a spirit of queerness. So keep that in mind. Kanyi pepere. And what of me, enemy of water, lover of another kind of body, God of sin buried no purunala? Have you no kola nut to break for me? I quench my thirst with libations, liquor spilled on club floors, an unknown offering. Pray to me at night while other gods sleep. I'll see, when you bow to me in her hips, your moan the unsung hymn I've been waiting to hear, both me and her hidden from light. Why commit yourself to sacrifice? Why this need for purity and shame? For a God with so many worshipers, only one enemy, why should I beg for praise? Naming of a God. Is your lover not tired of this? Guinea ki game when the soil is lifted and your secrets are left bare. When I rise from the living and say the unsaid, name you a child of mine, Nwam, it will only be repeating after you. I know I can be a cruel, cruel God. No, I have martyrs scattered across the world. They die in my name, but not in vain. I know other gods shake in my presence. Their followers the same, call my name like an insult, queer. They wish they could worship. So is it every day that you must hide from your lovers, from your God, from yourself? And the next poem is an expresses poem on Sugar Shack by Ernie Barnes. To the man that I will not go home with. Tonight we sweat, your cotton t-shirt clinging to your body, underarm stains soon to come as a consequence. I lift up my skirt and let the stale air pass by my thighs. Our hips move in conjunction with each other, fast paced to the horns blaring in the back. I watch your long brown arms extend towards the heavens and swiftly reach for the dip in my waist. Your mouth dry from sweat and cigarettes, full lips pulled into a small, sultry smile, just a few inches away from mine. We glide past flailing bodies, men and women moving to the same tune as us, begging each other not to stop. Because when it ends, we are no longer innocent. When it ends, we are nothing but a dying people in a dying world. When it ends, I'll have to tell you no and leave with my sister, saunter away like good girls should. When it ends, we will see each other in church tomorrow, and I'll pass by you in the train on my Monday morning commute, remembering the way that sweat trickled down the curve of my back and how your fingers followed, remembering the night when we were glued to the music, possessed by the spirit of lust and longing, finding home in a sugar shack. And this last poem is called Before I Become an Ancestor. It is the poem that inspired the anthology that I'm working on right now of the same name. And it is a collection of work by and for queer and femme Nigerians. Before I become an ancestor, I want to be a garden. I want to have the type of foliage that grows from dead things, like rotting fruit carcasses and slain egos. I want to be a thing that gives life without life being taken from it. I don't know if I was born to die, but before I do, let me be alive. Let me be a breathing thing that rises before it wilts. The way I carry the fallen inside of me, I've become a home for the dying, for my past lives and past lovers. Before I join them, let me make a place for myself. Let me build the walls of this room from the sound of voices that don't crack and tears that collect at the side of my jaw after rolling down my cheek. Let it never collapse. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Ugochi. That was incredible. And thank you, Didier and Charlie, for the conversation today. Thank you, everybody from the Museum of Contemporary Art North Miami for their support in preparing for today's event. Definitely go see this show if you're lucky to be there. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. So today's conversation will be up there shortly. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a poetry reading curated by Daniel Bouchard. And you can now all turn your microphones on and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Didier.
Thanks, Ugochi.
Yay.
Great
Wonderful
poem.
talk.
Fantastic reading.
Thank you.
Merci à tout le monde.
Great.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
thing
you,
said.
awesome.
Thank you.
Yay, thanks, Charlie.
Thanks. Amazing talk.
Thanks, Didier.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you, Dèyè. That was amazing.
Thank you so much.
that's incredible. Thank you.